Well, okay, let's take slavery.
Yes.
American slavery. And these are all not only the same religion, they're the same denomination. It's not that we're fighting the fuzzy wuzzies or something like that. No. It's Catholic against Catholic. It's Protestant against Protestant. And if you sit down and say, well, look, I want the Bible to lead me in this. Nobody else, the Bible. Well, it's obvious. It's saying that it's okay.
Oh, yes.
So this doesn't seem to be a very good system of steering people.
But if we take slavery, it's a very, very good example to think about. There isn't an intrinsic evil in slavery, in that it's been an institution that's been with the human race since almost the beginning, whatever the beginning is determined to be. But it's been one can't go back and find a moment when there was no slavery in recorded history. Of course, how one treats one's slave is another matter. We could say that, for example, a man or a woman who are employed under a contract of employment, they must be at their workplace at 9 and they must stay there till 5:30. One could say they're effectively in the possession of their employer for that period of time. Now, slavery isn't the word that's used. They're subject to a contract. But is there a fundamental difference in those hours? Now, of course, they can breach their contracts.
Well, they can just walk away and find something better. You can't do that.
But during the period of the working hours, say on that one day, if they walk away, they're in breach of contract. So they're potentially subject to penalties. Not penalties of whipping, lashing, or having your foot cut off, but they can be taken to court for breach of contract. So there are obligations which are much, much tamer and weaker than those under which a slave is obliged. Well, nonetheless, obligations.
No, I would say that yes, there are cases. Usually, people with white coats saying that you can have me all day, and then I'll come back tomorrow. We'll do this for at least 6 months. But the majority of people were like the sort of the working class man who, if he can get a better job somewhere else, is free to walk out next day.
Yes, that's true. But he is breaching his contract.
No, he hasn't got a contract.
Well, if you're a day labourer, then of course you've got to finish your day.
Well, you can finish your day.
Yeah. But if within that day you walk off, you've breached your contract.
I don't know even in that case. Obviously, he's not going to get his day's wage, but I don't think that he could be taken to the police.
Well, if he's... A lot of contracts, of course, are oral, so you're not signing anything. But nonetheless, I assume at the beginning of the day, the employer takes you on for that day. He needs you for that day to do X, Y, Z jobs. If you walk off part way and he can't replace you in that day, he might be in a difficulty. He might have had to complete a job under a contract with somebody else by the end of that day. So potentially, you can always be sued for breach of contract.
No, I don't think you can. I mean, you could possibly shout rude words after him when he's leaving, but I don't think in a case like that, and I have done quite a bit of work on labour in the early 19th century and that sort of stuff, and I didn't there come across anybody bringing a case against another man on that. Partly, I suppose, because it's so poor, you're not going to get anything out of it anyway.
Yeah, this is pure hypothetical. It would never happen, of course, and no doubt has never happened. I'm only actually taking it, because you went into the day labour, I wanted to even say there's an issue, but my general point was that people work for people, and though it's not slavery, there are obligations. Slavery itself is actually the ownership of the person, not their time. And it's the ownership of the person for their entire life, or until you sell them to somebody else. So there is obviously a significant distinction. But the idea of employer-employee is an idea which a relationship which arises under the capitalist system.
And a few others as well.
Prior to that, of course, you could have you have a feudal system where there's a different. It's not slavery, but it's not employer-employee.
You can't move the worker. You can only, if the worker doesn't want to be here anymore, he sells his authority, he goes and lives somewhere else. He can't take them with him. I think that is the main difference between the two.
I suppose there are quite a lot as well. I mean, one can say in the feudal system, of course, you've got certain obligations to your lord, which are related to custom and practice. So that sense of obligation, where the lord can actually, you wouldn't normally just walk off the land. I know it's impractical anyway in those days, but this obligation which ties you, it's a kind of almost perpetual tie you've got. But of course, it's not slavery. It's more like serfdom.
Yeah.
And so that system is, one could say, is not acceptable. But we're being a bit artificial when we transpose our ideas of labour relations from now into the Middle Ages. If you go before that, to say slavery is intrinsically evil is to transpose ideas which we have now into periods when slavery would have been a normal social relation.
Yeah, because we let it be. And like we can say, thou shalt not kill. So we're saying, okay, that is something that you can do, but we're saying not to do it. You could say similarly, thou shalt not have a slave.
I wonder though whether it's not just. I wouldn't draw the analogy between slavery and killing, murder, because I can't see how murder could ever be regarded as a legitimate activity in any kind of society that wasn't absolutely bizarre. But you can have perfectly normal societies where the slave relationship, master-slave relationship exists. And therefore, for me, the evil of slavery is not in the master-slave relationship itself. It's in the conduct of the master in relation to his slave. However, having said that wouldn't be the end of the story. I think there's clearly progress to be made to abandon this master-slave relationship and to move to a relationship of free men and women interacting with each other.
Now, what we have, in fact, I mean, I always feel sorry for the Confederates, even though, that's not really supposed to be what you think. Well, these guys are Bible readers. They're Christians. And they look at them again, and all the time, there's no sign that they shouldn't do this. So, I think that they put up an extraordinarily strong fight. And the reason was they were led astray by God. Because there's lots of references to slavery. There's no suggestion that it is in itself harmful. It's true this thing about it's better to have slaves if you're kind to them. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that if you're not, well, it doesn't matter, it's okay. It just seems like leading people astray.
Well, I think that when you look at the American Civil War, you have different proposals about how to deal with the slave question, answer the slave question. And of course, you see an interesting difference. You see the northern states, which are more industrial and advanced and capitalist, and the southern agrarian-based states, which want to keep slavery, which is more to be expected as an attitude because of the economic base with which they operate. The question is whether going to war was the way of dealing with that, or whether there was a proposal, for example, to the federal government to buy the slaves from the slave owners in the South, from gradually till the whole body of slaves would have been purchased by the end of the 19th century, and thus to avoid war. But that didn't fly.
No, it was the North that started the war.
Well, I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on that, but wasn't there a firing on Fort Sumter by the South?
Yeah, there was a firing on Fort Sumter, yeah. And whether or not there was any right to fire on it is very doubtful. The South didn't want a war. It just wanted to go away and carry on doing what it wanted. Why should it's a smaller organisation in the North? It wouldn't be very sensible to go out of your way to start a war if the other side isn't starting a war. If the North said, well, okay, yeah, you do what you like, but whatever you do, don't fire on Fort Sumter, and they said, nah, we're going to do it. Yeah, then I can see that. The thing with Fort Sumter was that, first of all, the North was getting very, very near to having a firing weapons. And then this is right in the harbour at Charleston. So what do? They said, look, please, would you like to move it somewhere else? And they said no. They were being provocative. Now, what then happened was that both sides got involved in this, trying to reinforce it. So it would have been the easiest thing in the world for the North just to, if it didn't want to have a fight, just move out, put this idea that you put to them, and said, well, how about it? It's interesting that people like Robert E. Lee, who fought and almost died for it, wasn't a slave owner. There were people, high-ranked Southerners, who said, no, we shouldn't be doing it.
Well, I know Lee was against slavery, wasn't he?
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. So you could see that there was a push that way. But what happens is that the North comes in, saying, well, look, we're bigger than you, so we don't need to go through all of this, talking about it. We'll just blow your head off. And the South said, well, try it. They did eventually, but it took an enormous amount, much more than they thought they did, that thought would happen, to do this. I mean, the people who you should say to, why didn't you go and do this and organise a peaceful settlement? Are the North, not the South.
But I'm not sort of saying one was at fault in that and the other was not at fault. It's simply that there were various options, and war became the option that was taken for one reason or another. But it's going back to the question which underlay the war, what to do about slavery. It isn't to me that you're looking at something that is so evil that you have to remove it straight away. One can see that there's a better way to engage in human relations than the slave master system. But when you've got societies which are heavily slave-based, then you have to look at how you can move away from that. And you just make the best efforts you can. But it doesn't mean that people who've got slaves are evil intrinsically. Just as the way you don't say that people who are against slavery are intrinsically good.
But what you had was, a plan to look at if they wanted to do it. And this was in the 1830s. The British said, okay, we'll abolish slavery in the West Indies. Mm-hmm. And this wasn't a state secret. Anybody from all over America could come and watch and say, oh, that's very interesting, and go back. So this was known that you could do it that way, and they had apprenticeships and things like that. After 4 years, you were completely free, and that all wasn't bad. The South could have been taught to, I'm sure, but there was no suggestion of talking to them. There was, you get rid of that, or we'll blow you up. And then when they'll go home and read their Bible for guidance, and he says, well, these guys had it, and they'll say, well, God must be on our side, and although we don't look as though we've got much of a chance, something's going to happen and we're going to be saved because we are doing the will of God, or at least of what God would commit.
What you say, though, there is indicative of the impossibility of treating the Bible as your sole authority. Because,
yes.
You could say, okay, slavery is allowed in the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yes.
Because St. Paul, when he writes to Philemon, does not say that you shouldn't be owning slaves. He's actually talking to him about being favourable in relation to this particular slave.
Yes.
However, there are clear indications which a Southerner might have ignored in relation to disciplining his slaves, which would, in the New Testament, demonstrate that it was wrong to be as cruel as they sometimes were to their slaves. What do you do, for example, if your slave just isn't happy and wants to go away? Do you chase after him, catch him, and whip him? I mean, can a Christian do that when you give them the New Testament? Well, the argument could go back and forth endlessly. You could argue yay and nay about the degree of punishment or whether any punishment is permissible, and that's where you have to have the church. But the church itself doesn't therefore say automatically, oh yeah, this position is right, that position is wrong. The church looks at all the circumstances and comes to a decision, as we'd say, guided by God the Holy Spirit. It isn't necessarily an immediate decision. We have, going back to 1435 in the bull Sicut Dudum of Eugenius IV, an instruction by the Pope to the Spanish to release the occupants of the Canary Islands, whom they'd enslaved and whose goods they'd taken, to give their goods back and to release them. And we have more statements against enslavement regarded as kidnapping in those early centuries. But it doesn't mean you've got the church saying, well, slavery in itself as an institution is fundamentally evil. And I think that what we have is the church's influence moving Europe against slavery, and the Spirit getting us to a point where we say, right, society is such now, we shouldn't have this institution anymore. All people should be free in their social relations.